Welcome to this presentation covering performance appraisals, training, and development. This presentation is going to be pretty different than the others, or maybe most of the others that we've had in this course. There aren't going to be cases, there aren't going to be statutes. Well, actually, there'll be a little bit of statute talk, but for the most part, it won't be a heavy dose of law in this section. What we're really going to look at here is good or best practices in these areas. Because when employers have better practices, they tend to have less legal risk. When one is organizing an employment law course, one needs to kind of make some choices. Is one going to organize the course around various statutes, or is one going to organize the course based upon the various events in an employee's career? The hiring time, the appraisal time, the promotion time, possibly the termination time, the time that he or she enrolls in benefits. I mean, there can be lots of different points along the line that you could organize the various content around. In some sense, the second choice, arranging it around significant moments in the career of the employee, makes sense because that's actually how we interact with the employee. And that makes sense from an HR perspective to look at it that way. Most courses, however, don't organize things that way because then you would have to talk about Title VII and Age Discrimination Employment Act and Americans with Disabilities Act and all of these statutes again and again and again, because each one of these statutes is going to be relevant at each moment through the career of the employee. I mean, there would be certain topics that would be more relevant at one time versus another. For example, there really wouldn't be a lot of OSHA issues in the pre-employment period of time. There wouldn't be a lot of ERISA issues at the pre-employment time. So there would be certain things that would kind of come in and go out, but you'd kind of have to teach a mini version of the whole course whenever you approach one of these issues. But you can see the appeal. You can see how it's nice to say, well, when you're hiring somebody, these are the things you need to focus on. And when you're promoting somebody or considering promoting them, these are the issues we ought to think about. So what I've done in this course is, in addition to the sections on statutes, I also have just a few modules in which we talk about some very important moments in the progress of an employee. Sometimes that the employer is at special danger from making a mistake. And many times the reason why this time is dangerous is that the employer doesn't really recognize the danger. He or she isn't aware that what he or she is about to do is potentially a pretty big deal in the life of this particular employee. And so what I'm going to do is kind of unpack some of those issues. This presentation, though, assumes that you kind of know the underlying law, because I'm not going to repeat all the things that we covered in previous semesters. So this is kind of building upon the earlier content. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to discuss, as I said before, performance appraisals as well as the topic of training and development. And within the topic of performance appraisals, we're going to discuss performance criteria and standards, how we're going to measure the performance of the worker, performance appraisal process, what that should look like, and feedback on the performance. When we talk about training and development, we're going to talk about what kind of training is legally required, or at least a really good idea. And we're also going to discuss the topic of how do we select people to be trained. So let's continue. Performance appraisals will be our first topic. Generally, there is no legal obligation to appraise or to evaluate employees, or to have a formal process along those lines. But the reality is that people are constantly being appraised and evaluated. That's just part of human nature, that we're constantly saying, oh, I'm happy that Bob did that. I'm not happy that Bob did this. That's just the nature of the human experience. Many of us are not very good at giving negative feedback. Maybe we have a new employee and he or she has dropped the ball. We'll say that the new employee is Bob. And Bob has come late to work one day. Some managers might directly confront Bob and say, hey, Bob, you can't be late to work. That's something that's going to result in you being dismissed if you do that, if you continue to do that. So let's be careful. You may want to, plan to arrive 10 minutes early so you won't be in danger of being late. That's a good approach. But unfortunately, too many of us, and I include myself in this, too many of us try to avoid the topic. Oh, well, it won't happen again. Or if I'm just maybe a little bit distant with Bob, he'll pick up that he can't be late, and that's a problem. But of course, avoiding a topic or kind of being passive aggressive about the topic really isn't fair to Bob. And honestly, it's not fair to the employer either, because Bob may not get the message. And so Bob may ultimately need to be dismissed, and yet he was never really given a chance to know what was going on, to know what the expectations are. One good way of approaching this issue of performance appraisals is to be very clear from the beginning, before Bob has had a chance to be late, to say, Bob, I just want to let you know, in your particular role, it's really important that you be at your desk, able to work at, let's say the day starts at 7:45, at 7:45 a.m. Being there at 7:46 is not okay. You need to be there at 7:45. Some employees choose to arrive 10 or 15 minutes early just to make sure that they're going to be there on time. Problems like traffic jams and things like that don't cut it here. And so you really do need to focus and be here on time. Do you have any questions? And so documenting that, having that conversation, and then when there is a late, approaching Bob and saying, hey, Bob, we understand that sometimes extraordinary circumstances happen, but just to let you know, this is a problem, and you can't continue to have lates. And perhaps at this point, you start talking to Bob about how the progressive discipline works. Once you've had 2 tardies in a 6-month period, we give you a written warning. Once you have your 3rd tardy, we move to a final warning. If you have the 4th tardy in 6 months, we're going to end your employment. And so that way Bob knows what's happening in his progress. He knows what the expectation is. He can't say, I didn't know. I didn't know what I needed to do. He may choose not to do what he needs to do, but it's going to be his choice at that point. So being very clear about the performance standards is a really helpful tool. It helps save both parties from those awkward, uncomfortable conversations. But when there is a problem, the manager is well served if he or she talks to Bob as soon as possible. Obviously in a private location, one doesn't need to act like it's the end of the world when a problem comes up, but it needs to be addressed. Bob, you were late today. Please don't do that in the future. It's really important here that you be on time. Thanks for your help with this. And move on. Make a little notation on your day planner that you had that conversation with Bob. Being consistent in this area is the way to avoid problems. Now, it's going to feel perhaps like what you maybe want to do is avoid the problem, is to, it's not going to happen again. Most of the time, that's not what happens. Most of the time, a problem ignored is a problem that festers. And so I encourage you to set the standard early, and when there's deviations from that standard, to be clear and quick and professional about communicating that. So we don't have to do performance appraisals, but the reality is that at some point, you're going to need to be able to differentiate performance, because there's going to be promotional opportunities, there's going to be disciplinary or maybe layoffs that have to happen, there's going to be raises that need to be awarded, perhaps on a merit basis. So you have to be able to say, well, I'm giving Sally a $1 an hour raise. I'm giving Bob a 75-cent raise. Well, why are you giving Bob a lower raise? Well, Bob's performance wasn't as good. Well, how can you prove that? Well, one of the tools to help you prove that is the performance appraisal. It can be a very powerful tool in supporting and justifying employment decisions that you make. It can also be that knife in your back that causes you lots of problems. What the courts are primarily going to be interested in when they evaluate performance appraisals is, were they discriminatory? So the more you can make your standards objective, the less likely it's going to be discriminatory. So for example, imagine that Bob is supposed to test 20 widgets an hour. That's the standard. And he has averaged only tested 19.6 widgets an hour. Well, that's an objective standard. He either has made it or he's not. A subjective standard would be, is Bob pleasant to work with? Does he have a positive attitude? Well, I mean, reasonable people can differ on that. But it's hard to differ on whether Bob made that 20 widgets an hour standard or not. I mean, either he did or he didn't. If he didn't, he might have an explanation. Oh, well, he was asked to do too many side projects, or he was being especially careful, or the standard wasn't reasonable to begin with, or who knows what the other explanations are. So he may have a response to why he satisfied or didn't satisfy the objective standard, but an objective standard is one that you can look at and measure, and there's not a lot of gray area there. A subjective standard is one that has a fair amount of gray area. Ideally, you want to stay in the area of the objective standard. It would be lovely if we could just stay in that one area and really just focus on that. But that's not reality. I mean, certain jobs maybe lend themselves to that. But for example, my job, being a teacher, how can I, or the quality of my performance in my job isn't an objective thing. I mean, I suppose we could have a test, and everybody who's taking a particular course, you know, there could be a test at the end, and if my students do better than some other teacher students, then maybe I get a higher raise, or if my students don't do as well as another teacher, then I get a lower raise. That would be an objective standard. Objective standards, you know, are objective or clear-cut, but they also can have problems. For example, my students might just be smarter than the other person's students. And so maybe that's why my students are doing better than the other person's students. And so in that sense, it wouldn't be fair for the other person to receive a less impressive raise simply because he happened to have gotten less conscientious or less smart students. Now, over time, probably the student quality would average out, and so it really would reflect a kind of inherent teaching skills, perhaps. But you would need probably a lot of data to sort that issue out. So oftentimes in these situations, there either isn't objective data, or the objective data is pretty flawed, and so you end up looking at subjective data. For example, maybe somebody comes to one of my classes and sits in, and he or she, that evaluator, reaches conclusions. She's effective in the classroom, she's not effective, the things like that. Reasonable people might be able to differ on those points. Now, during that evaluation, the evaluator would be able to find some objective information. For example, the evaluator could say whether I was in class ready to start teaching at the beginning of class. That's an objective a characteristic. The evaluator could also determine whether I continued the class to the very end. So that'd be a second objective characteristic. A third objective characteristic could be, did I take attendance during the class? A fourth objective characteristic could be, did I seem to know the names of my students? Did I use their names, at least some of the names, during the class time? That would be a fourth goal. A fifth goal could be, or maybe, excuse me, a fifth qualification could be, did I use tools such as the whiteboard or the projector, or did I have handouts? Did I use other tools to conclude that this is, or that I was using these for learning purposes? But then there could also be subjective characteristics. For example, did the instructor seem to be a subject matter expert? Did she seem to know the topic? Was she open to questions from students? Did she seem to have a lesson plan that was well organized and effective? Those reasonable people might be able to differ on. And so you can see you want to focus on objective, but those qualifications may not at the end of the day really help you decide whether this teacher is good or not. Whether I'm on class on time doesn't really tell you a lot about whether I'm a good teacher. If I'm habitually late to class, that would be an indication I'm not a very good teacher. But the fact that I'm simply at class at the assigned time doesn't demonstrate that I'm a good teacher, obviously. So you can see how there's going to be a combination of objective and subjective characteristics that you're going to be evaluated. When you're looking at subjective characteristics, though, the evaluator should ideally be as clear about those as possible. Provide examples. When Professor Groover was explaining how offer and acceptance happens in a contract, she provided 3 very clear examples involving blah, 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 X, Y, and Z, those particular things. And so now she's saying that I was effective there. Let's say that the evaluator didn't think I was effective when a student asked a question about what is consideration. And I said, we'll talk about that later. And so the evaluator felt that I cut that student off and that I should have provided a better explanation. So you can see how even with objective data, you can provide examples that will help me, the person being evaluated, know where I was weaker, where I could perhaps do a better job in the future, and also gives a factual support to how the overall appraisal is going to happen. So by including ideally objective, and if we have to go subjective, detailed examples, this helps the evaluator avoid possibly making an evaluation that looks discriminatory. This obviously is a major concern. We want to have evaluations that remove factors such as race, religion, ethnicity, age from that evaluation. And so by having clear criteria, ideally that are objective, it can help the evaluator move beyond assumptions about people based upon these external characteristics. Invariably, when you appraise someone, you are going to say some bad things about them. It's probably not a very good appraisal if you have no constructive feedback. Even your best performers, perhaps especially your best performers, you ought to give them some feedback that lets them know how they can move to the next level. Skills that they might need to develop, characteristics that they are relying on to their detriment. And so this is important to include that. But you probably don't want an appraisal that's completely negative. The problem with that is that it makes the evaluation look unfair. So you ideally want to have some positives and some negatives in virtually every appraisal. Now the balance between those is going to vary. Your star employee may be 95% positive, 5% negative. That person who's just about to be terminated for poor performance, it might be 10% positive, 90% negative. But you ought to ideally have a little bit of both, barring some really, really extreme circumstances. When you talk about negative characteristics, you need to do it in a diplomatic but clear way. You want to avoid harsh, unnecessarily terse and direct and painful type of language. On the other hand, you don't want to be so vague about what you're talking about that the employee may not be able to figure it out. When I was in private practice, I worked with an employer that used a term to discuss performance flaws, and that term was opportunities. And so what the employer would say is, you have opportunities in this area. This was a euphemistic way of saying, you're screwing up in this area. You need to stop doing this. So maybe you had an opportunity about your attendance. And the idea is, you have an opportunity because you're not doing well now and you need to start. That's the gist of it. Euphemisms like that are probably not the best approach. It's not a terrible thing to do, but it's probably better to say, this is an area of weakness, or this is a non-strength, perhaps. This is an area you need to work on, to be clearer about the opportunity. So that the employee knows what the standard is, where his performance is, and that there is a gap. It's also a good idea when you're identifying negative characteristics to give the employee assistance in reaching that performance level. I mean, sometimes the assistance may not make sense. For example, an employee who's habitually late to work doesn't really need assistance, most likely. He just needs to get out of bed earlier. But there may be some ways that the employee can be helped. For example, you might provide the employee with a copy of the bus schedule. You might suggest that the employee set his or her alarm 30 minutes earlier. There might be some suggestions that you can incorporate, even though at the end of the day, it's going to be the employee's responsibility to address this issue. But if it's work-related stuff, you may be able to offer that employee training opportunities, or you may be able to give that employee coaching in the workplace, allowing that employee perhaps to work more closely with a successful employee. These can be strategies that can make sense. And as you share these and document them, it's going to make it seem less like you are sabotaging or hoping this person would fail. The more that you can paint the picture, hopefully an accurate picture, that you were concerned about this employee, that you wanted the employee to be successful, that you were empowering this employee to be successful, the less likely it will seem like it's a discriminatory appraisal. So how do we use performance appraisals? Well, we use them for lots of different functions. We use them to decide who we're going to promote, who we're going to demote sometimes, who we're going to offer training and development to, who's going to get a raise and how much that raise is going to be, and who is going to be dismissed. In the areas of training and development, it can play out in two different ways, probably more than two, but at least two. Sometimes the employee who's struggling, the poor performer, is the one who gets the training. After all, he apparently needs the training, right? Sometimes training and development is offered to your star players to help move them to that next level, to get ready for that promotion. So training and development can play out in both arenas. Dismissals can play out in a couple of ways too. Sometimes it strictly is a situation where you have an employee who's just not doing what they need to do, and so you do look at dismissing them for poor performance. Sometimes, though, dismissals come up not because of poor performance, but because of a change in the business plan, or perhaps a downturn in the economy, and so there needs to be layoffs. A pretty common tool to allow the employer to decide who is going to be retained and who is going to be let go is to look at recent performance appraisals. Let's say you happen to have 20 people in a particular position, but you need to cut 5 of those positions. Well, there's several different ways you can approach this. One way would be to hire the 5 most recent employees to that position, kind of the last in, first out idea. Certainly there are operations who do it that way. That's a common approach in a unionized facility, and some entities that are concerned about the possibility of union activity might have an approach like that as part of its union avoidance strategy. But more common, especially in this part of the country, would be the idea of, well, let's try to retain our 15 best people. Well, how do we decide? It's certainly true that the employer could do a round of appraisals right there and decide who are our 15 best. Usually they don't, though. There's kind of 2 reasons why they don't. First of all, we already have all this data from past performance appraisals, so it doesn't really make sense to kind of reinvent the wheel when we already have the data. The second reason, though, is perhaps the more important reason. When managers know that how they appraise this person is going to affect who is retained and who is let go, they may be inclined to grade on the curve for people whom they like better, or who are in a particularly difficult position, or who they just relate to more. Perhaps a single mom manager might relate more to that single mom employee and want to help that person retain employment, even though that person may not be the best worker. Or the older white male manager might feel some empathy, some connection with that older white male employee, and there may be some sense of, I want to keep Bob here. I feel a connection with him. And as a result, the younger African American female is let go, even though perhaps she was the better worker. So for those reasons, employers like to use pre-existing appraisals. Now, how that's done is going to vary. Some look at the last appraisal, some look at the last 3 appraisals or the last 5 appraisals. They may take an average or consider the 2 highest or the 2 lowest. I mean, there's an infinite number of patterns for that. Whatever choice is selected, though, it should be done blindly. And by that I mean, you shouldn't go and check to see what people's appraisals are and then try to figure, okay, well, we all want to get rid of Bob, so let's see what our criteria can be that will cause Bob to be one of the 5 that are gone. Or none of us want Sally to go, so let's see what type of performance appraisal system would allow us to keep Sally but make sure Bob is gone. Now, ideally, the system that we select ought to not be driven by a particular outcome, expectation, or hope. It ought to be driven by what makes most sense for the business. So, for example, having a system that says we're going to keep the best performers unless their surname starts with an R doesn't make a lot of sense. People are going to look at that and say, sounds like you were hoping to save somebody whose last name was R. And obviously that doesn't bode well for the enforceability, the appropriateness of that particular criteria. When you are using performance appraisals, you want to make sure that you have good quality ones to work with. But of course, when these performance appraisals were developed, no one had any idea you were going to do a layoff. I mean, you may be going back and looking at appraisals from 5 years earlier. And so it's important whenever the manager is doing the appraisal for him or her to realize this could be really, really important. I need to take this seriously. This person's job or somebody else's some other person's job may be on the line based upon how I perform this appraisal. It's a good idea with appraisals to have some kind of balancing mechanism in effect. You can have one manager who's hard, who gives everybody a C grade on the appraisal, and then you can have another manager who gives everybody A's. Well, if you have to do the reduction in force, the manager who gave everyone A's, his folks are going to appear to be better performers, when in fact it's just a matter of the manager being an easier grader. And so at the time that the appraisals are being drafted and considered, probably those 2 managers, assuming they share a boss, the boss needs to review those appraisals, and the boss needs to give some tough love and say, wait a second, you gave everyone a C and you gave everyone an A. I find that hard to believe. I happen to know many of these workers, and some of the C's should be B's and some of the A's should be B's and maybe C's. And so, let's rank these and let's figure out a system that works so that it has integrity across that population. So how do courts look at performance appraisals? Do they care? I mean, is it going to be a situation in which the court or the jury is going to say, well, you know what, we would have rated Bob as a 4 instead of a 3, or we would have given Mary more credit for her positive attitude? No, that's not. There's not going to be that level of second guessing. The issue is going to be, was there discrimination or some other illegal motive in the assigning of the performance criteria on the appraisal? Reasonable people can differ about whether this person ought to get an A or a B or a C, as long as the appraiser is consistent across his population and has thought through, or based upon what the appraisal says, it appears to have thought through how this person's performance is and has concrete examples. Very likely that's going to be an appraisal that's going to stand up. But it has to be something that somebody invested a fair amount of reflection in. I'm going to share with you something that happens pretty commonly in corporate America. It happened for all the years I was at JCPenney, and it happens at Collin College. And that is that managers and employees are oftentimes told to do their first draft of their appraisal. Now, obviously, ratings aren't going to be part of this, but it's a very common thing for them to provide the examples and to talk about accomplishments and things along those lines. Because the employee more than anyone else knows the specifics. He or she knows what he or she has accomplished over the course of the year. And so this raw data then is presented to the manager, and the manager's got material to work with. Now, the manager is likely to add his or her own material. Let's say when Bob writes his appraisal, he doesn't mention the fact that he was late to work a third of the time. He talks about how he's really good with customers and how he's been able to bring in new business that the company hadn't had in the past, which is very good stuff, certainly, but it's not addressing the tardiness issue. So now the manager is going to have to go back and add that information to the appraisal. But at least he has something to work with. And if he uses some of Bob's material, then that communicates to Bob as well as to a potential court that he was open to what Bob had to say. Bob was a participant in this appraisal process. So that's another good idea. It helps save some time on the part of the manager. It helps the employee feel engaged in the process, and it gives the appraisal more credibility. It's a good idea to do performance appraisals at least annually. During the first year, it's a good idea to do one when the probationary period ends. Oftentimes, the probationary period ends at the 30 or 90-day point, sometimes at the 180-day point. It's good to sit down with the employee and say, this is where you're doing great, this is where you're not doing great, you need to improve here, continue doing good work here. And giving that feedback and documenting that conversation. You may also have another touch point before the annual appraisal. And then going forward from that point, it will probably be an annual system. Some employers have a rotating basis where appraisals are covered at various points throughout the year. Some have them kind of all at one time. It's nice to have them all at one time because it allows the more senior manager to kind of balance out the grades, or so that there's consistency across the group. It's harder to have that consistency if manager A does his appraisals in January and manager B does his in March. There isn't the ability to kind of level at that point. So usually, or commonly, let me put it this way, employers will have, at least for a particular division or a particular department, have the appraisals for a particular time. Of course, you're going to want to have them written, and you're going to want to have them on a particular format that's established by HR. You're also going to want to have goals where the employee has been working on throughout the course of the year, action steps that he or she is going to be expected to take. Usually these are going to be broken down into goals that he has, for example, increase sales by 5% or have no more than 3 tardies this year. And then more generalized performance characteristics, be a positive team player, things like that. Oftentimes you could separate these into objective standards and subjective standards. Many times the objective standards will vary from year to year. One year you may be asked to work on special project XYZ and complete that. Another year you may be encouraged to attend a training session on topic PDQ. And so sometimes the goals will reflect those particular emphasis. Many times the employee will be asked to make suggestions as to what his or her goals should be for the next year. Again, this is an idea that helps the employee because the employee is oftentimes in the best position to know where his strengths and weaknesses are and what he would most benefit from. So it gives him the opportunity to focus on those things. It also allows him to feel included in the process and have some ownership there. It's a good idea that when you have these types of appraisals that you remain open to the possibility that goals may change. Maybe you had a 5% sales goal when the economy was great at the beginning of the year, but there's been a very big downturn in the economy, which has nothing to do with your employee, and so it may make sense to adjust goals. Maybe it doesn't make sense, but that's at least something to entertain. Or perhaps the plan had been to send the employee to learn about this new software, but then the company decided to discontinue using that new software and to go with a different software. Well, it hardly makes sense to send Bob to learn about software that isn't being used, so it's time to dust off the goals and rewrite those. Let's see some common performance criteria that are often part of the appraisal. Work quality and quantity. Again, if you're working on an assembly line, you may have a goal of 20 widgets an hour with no more than 3% being held to be of low quality. It's a good idea oftentimes to have an attendance and punctuality goal. Again, you need to be aware that no-fault attendance policies, once the employee becomes FMLA eligible on the first anniversary, can become problematic. There's no problem having the goals, but you have to consider, well, I can't count FMLA events when I consider those goals. I once had a client that would have employees pretty routinely that had some significant absenteeism, oftentimes for FMLA purposes. The feeling in the unit was some of the people in the unit really abused FMLA. They really weren't that sick, but they had a diagnosis that they could kind of use when they didn't really want to come to work. Anyway, because these employees were FMLA eligible, the absences they had that were related to that didn't count against perfect attendance programs. So you'd have these workers who were pretty routinely absent who would be getting perfect attendance awards. This, for the true perfect attenders or for the almost perfect attenders, could be a real morale hit. Wait a second, I'm here every day and I missed one day for a very good reason and I don't get a perfect attendance, but Bob, who misses work all the time and who doesn't seem to be that sick, he's getting perfect attendance. And so there can be some issues along those lines sometimes that come up. So when you're setting these standards, you may want to think through how this is going to be received in the unit. These usually work better in an hourly population versus a management population, because usually in the management field, number one, it's less common for there to be attendance problems, and number two, punctuality may not be quite so important because the employee might be working late at night in addition, and so that they be here at exactly 8 may not be quite so important. Then you consider the issue of judgment. Obviously, this is going to be very subjective, but again, especially when you're talking about your managers, the evaluation is going to inherently be somewhat subjective, but you want to, as much as possible, have examples of it. Well, you had that customer complaint. Instead of listening carefully to the customer, showing empathy, and trying different approaches to resolve it, you were harsh with the customer, and the customer took his business away. So that's an example that you have. And so have ideally a few of those when you have examples, say, of poor judgment. Teamwork is obviously hugely important, but it's also some level of subjectivity. After all, if you have some tension in the team, who's to blame for it? I mean, probably to some extent, all the people who are causing the tension are partially to blame for it, but one or more people might be more responsible than others. Well, how do you make that case? Well, again, one way is by having examples and to look at it from that perspective. The last one is perhaps the most difficult: leadership. What makes a leader? What makes somebody not be a leader? This is very difficult to define. And part of the problem is that who a leader is, or what that characteristic is going to vary from person to person. How a person defines that term is very subjective. And so you want it to be as clear as possible to the employee. So ideally, you want to be more granular in this area. You want to say, this is what leadership means. For example, you might mean coming up with new ideas. You might mean leading by example, always being that positive person, always being the first person at the meeting ready to contribute. You want it to be clear what you mean by this term if you happen to use this in your culture. Be specific, provide examples, talk about the characteristics, and ideally point to times where the person has exhibited good leadership, and perhaps point out at times when they haven't shown those good leadership characteristics. But again, don't assume that everybody means the same thing when they use words like leadership and also like judgment. Employers are free to establish whatever criteria for evaluation they want, assuming that it is not discriminatory. Obviously, you have to consider the needs of disabled employees and also employees who are experiencing FMLA issues, or perhaps are being called up for military leave. You want to be consistent in applying your standards. If there's going to be differences in how you apply them, you want to be sure that the differences are not tied to protected characteristics, unless it's perhaps to give somebody who's disabled a bit of some flexibility. And again, as we said before, you want to be as objective as possible, recognizing that there's a limitation here. And obviously, you want to focus on job-related characteristics. I once heard a manager talk about his employment in the past, and he said, you know what, when I started working here many years ago, if you got a divorce, you were never going to get another promotion. That was the philosophy in the company. The idea is if you couldn't manage your personal life, why should the employer trust you with the employer's assets? You weren't going to get fired, but you weren't ever going to see another promotion. That really isn't very job related, because the connection between having a successful marriage and having a successful career just isn't very strong, especially since in today's world we have no-fault divorce, and so there's not necessarily a connection between getting a divorce and even being a bad spouse. So you want to, not that I think there's many employers who consider divorce a factor in performance appraisals, but you do want to be sure that whatever you're looking at really is job related. A more common thing we might see now would be somebody who doesn't participate in the happy hours, or who doesn't go to lunch with the gang, or who not into football and doesn't want to talk about the Cowboys over right before the meeting comes in. Will people interpret that to be standoffishness or whatever? Maybe it is standoffishness, or maybe it's just a different set of interests. And so the issue is, when you're talking about business and interacting about business things, is this person standoffish? That's the issue that ought to be the focus, not whether he enjoys going to the bar to get a few beers after work. Of course, when we're talking about performance appraisals, we do need to consider the special circumstances of the disabled employee, because the disabled employee may find it difficult to perform certain tasks that the other workers are able to perform with ease. For example, there may be some non-essential parts of the job that is usually part of the appraisal process for other folks. For example, let's say that you happen to have several receptionists in your office. And one of the things that receptionists typically do is they spend about 30 minutes a day being a relief file clerk in the file room. You happen to have one receptionist, though, who is wheelchair bound, and the way that the file cabinets are situated, a person who's a wheelchair user is not going to be able to file. And so this particular employee isn't going to be able to do this non-essential function of being a relief file clerk. Well, let's say for the other 5 receptionists, you had that as one of their performance goals on their appraisal. That's not going to work for the wheelchair user receptionist. What you may want to do is add some other task to his or her plate. Perhaps this receptionist might spend 30 minutes doing relief typing, and somebody who would have been doing typing at that time now goes and does the file clerk function for those 30 minutes. And so that is a way to perhaps adjust the workflow. So again, the non-essential functions and marginal functions that the disabled person cannot perform because of the limitations of the disability shouldn't be part of his or her appraisal. So we've completed discussing performance criteria and standards. Let's go on and talk about the appraisal process. Every company is going to have its own, but whatever the process is, you want it to be consistent throughout the organization. If you appraise one person, you need to appraise everyone in that category. So be sure that you have the same standards in place, the same process in place, the same checks and balances in place for everybody, so there's consistency. Again, you don't want that negative appraisal that's handled a little bit differently than everybody else's to be evidence, perhaps, of pretext to justify a layoff or a termination. You want to be consistent in how these processes go. Typically, you're going to want to have the direct manager or supervisor of the employee conduct the appraisal. Oftentimes you'll want to have another person present, especially if you anticipate that the employee is not going to take this news in a positive light. And so you may have a second person. Some employers always have two people present because, of course, if you only have a second person present when the interview is difficult, you're not being consistent, right? And you're also, in some sense, kind of making it a little bit public that this isn't going to be a good appraisal because everybody sees that group go into the room. So it's important to think through those issues carefully to decide how you're going to proceed in these areas. Certainly, as you are going down the road towards termination, so you perhaps are doing later performance appraisals, you are likely to want to have another witness present. If the workforce is unionized, there may be wine garden rights, or actually there will be wine garden rights that are in play during this process. And so be sure to think through the wine garden protections that the employee might have. Just a little refresher, a wine garden right is the right of the employee to have the union steward present when there is the potential for disciplinary outcomes as a result of the meeting. At this current time, non-unionized employees do not have wine garden rights. That is something that has been in flux from time to time, but at this time that's not the case. Let's talk about the contents of the appraisal. We already said you should not shy away from criticism, but you want it to be measured, measurable when possible, and professional. You don't want to avoid extreme language such as, "You're the worst employee I've ever had," or "You're the sloppiest employee that I ever had." You want it to be measured. Bob's desk is not as neat as it should be. It's difficult for us to find the documents that we need when Bob is away. When I ask Bob for a certain report, it takes him an unusually long period of time to get me that report. And again, if you can have the balance between positive and negative comments, that does show that this is or hopefully demonstrate that the appraiser is being careful and not being biased when he or she creates the appraisal. Okay, let's talk about bell curves. You may have heard of the concept of a bell curve. A bell curve is called a bell curve because it looks like a bell. Most of the appraisal ratings are going to be kind of in the middle range, the C range. There's going to be a few D's and a few B's and a very few F's and a very few A's. It used to be, in fact, in law school, even today, you'll see these forced type of bell curves. My notes here don't call it a bell curve, they call it a forced distribution method. In this situation, the manager is told, okay, you've got 10 people on your team. You can give 2, we'll call it a 1 or an A. You can give 3 2s or Bs. I'll put an A here and B. You can give 4 3s or Cs. See, now we have, I guess, 7, 8. But you have to give at least 1 4, which is a needs improvement grade. And of course, if you think you need more than 1 4, then certainly you can adjust these. But you can't give more than 2 and 3 in our higher ratings. Well, the manager might say, but I've got 3 awesome workers. That means I'm going to have to downgrade one of them. Well, that's what you have to do. I once heard an example. A manager came to me and said, listen, I'm only permitted to give a single of the highest ratings. So this year I'm giving it to Bob, and next year I'll give it to Sally, and the year after that I'll give it to Teresa, because all 3 of them deserve it. And I'm going to tell them, hey, I'm limited. I can only give it to one of you, so I'm giving it to this one first, and the next year you'll get it, and the year after that someone else will get it. That's not, of course, what the intention of the program is, but this system has a benefit in that it forces the managers to have consistency across the group. So you don't have the easy grader and the hard grader. There are even companies that have a philosophy of, we want to get rid of the bottom 10% pretty consistently. The idea is that the bottom 10% is always kind of not carrying their weight. Well, maybe the first year you roll that out, that does make sense. But every year the bottom 10% isn't carrying their weight, that's a little hard to believe because eventually you're going to run out of people that are slackers at the bottom, right? You will have cut those out, and presumably you're hiring people. You're not hiring 100% of slackers going forward. So systems like that probably aren't going to work for the long time, and certainly they can be bad for morale. But as we can see, there are certain advantages. They do create a certain level of consistency, and they allow there to be some distinctions. If managers are permitted to give everyone an A or a 1, how do you handle layoffs when you don't have any distinctions between performance? And so there are some advantages to forced distributions as well as some disadvantages. And again, if you are in a policy-making position in your company, you'll want to consider how much to this extreme you want to have, and how much do you want managers to have a lot of flexibility in how they rate people. Let's discuss the topic of feedback on performance. The performance appraisal process should never be a surprise to the employee. The employee should never leave his or her appraisal and say, wow, I didn't see that coming. If there are performance problems, the employee ought to know well in advance, not just the week before, but 6 months before, that there's a problem. There ought to be regular, perhaps informal, but regular conversations. So everything that's documented in the performance appraisal should be old news to that worker. Now that's what should be the case. That's not what always happens. I mean, it's better to document the performance appraisal and it be a surprise than not to document it at all, right? So I mean, it's an improvement to talk about it for the first time on the appraisal than never at all. But it's much, much better to have these regular conversations. So when the appraisal is happening, obviously the employer should communicate the performance appraisal to employees, and there's lots of different ways of doing it. Sometimes the manager will read it to the employee. Probably more commonly, the employee reads it to himself. Then there should be an opportunity for discussion. Sometimes this happens, sometimes it doesn't happen. And then the employee ought to be given the opportunity to respond, to write a rebuttal, or to say something else that they think might be meaningful, some information perhaps that hasn't been brought to the attention of the employer before. An employee having been given the opportunity to respond, and when the employee chooses not to respond, that's a good fact for the employer because it suggests that the employee didn't feel that there was a need to respond in any more detail. An issue to think about when we're talking about performance appraisals is the signature. Typically, on the performance appraisal, you'll have the signature of the manager, probably the signature of someone from HR, and probably the signature of the manager's manager. And then you'll have a place for the employee to sign. Let's say the performance appraisal is not positive, or at least not positive in the minds of the employee. The employee may not want to sign. The employee should not be required to sign. But the manager ought to explain to the employee that your signature here does not mean that you are in agreement with the performance appraisal. All it means is you've seen it. You've been told what this document says. You may agree with it, you may not agree with it. And that one common thing to see on the performance appraisal is an opportunity for there to be comments at that time, or perhaps a later time where the employee can add the comments. But even with that caveat, the employee doesn't have to sign. You should never force the employee to sign. If the employee chooses not to sign, then what the manager ought to do is sign the manager's name and say something like, employee declined to sign. Better to say declined than refused. So let's say that the performance that your particular employee has had has been disappointing. There's not any indication that it will get better in the short term. You've had these conversations and it just seems like that this is a challenge, and you have to increase the level of attention to this. Organizations have different names for this process, but a common one is the Performance Improvement Plan, or the PIP process. In this process, the employee is given goals. The idea is that these goals are measurable and they are reasonable. They can be attained by the employee. So you want to have measurable and reasonable goals. You also want to provide the employee training, if that makes sense. Now, if the employee is failing because of a lack of training, then this sounds like a problem that probably can be solved. The performance improvement plan ought to explain what the consequence will be if the employee fails the plan, and there ought to be a date that the plan ends. The timeline should be reasonable, especially if the employee is going to need additional training. So you ought to talk with you ought to have a plan. What's reasonable to give this employee time to turn this boat around. Usually at the end of a performance improvement plan, if the performance has not been attained, the consequence will be separation of employment, possibly demotion, but usually separation of employment. So we're talking about pretty high stakes, so we have to dot the I's and cross the T's in the plan. Some things that can be challenged in plans are, is the criteria objective enough? Or is it all going to go back to whether the manager likes the employee or not? Another one is, was the employee given enough time to change their performance? And finally, were the goals reasonable, or was the employee being set up? If everybody else does 20 widgets an hour, but now we're asking this employee to do 40 widgets an hour, not so reasonable. So you have to question those goals when the manager brings those to you, making sure they are credible goals for this particular employee. Let's talk about training and development. Most of the time, employers are not required to provide training, but there are some times where employers are required to provide training. One is in the area of OSHA. Another is, although it's not legally required, it's highly, highly recommended, is to provide sexual harassment training and more generally employment discrimination training. Sometimes this is referred to as diversity training, which is somewhat a different thing, but not completely. These are areas where it makes sense to train and it makes sense to document that training. Related issues are going to be who receives the training, when they receive the training, what particular type of training they're receiving, and who's going to pay for that training. All of these are important issues. There's not a right or a wrong to many of these answers, but you ought to think through the issues, and you ought to make sure that you have a defendable decision that is consistent throughout the organization. OSHA is one of those areas where you really do need to train. You need to train employees so they are aware of what the policies are and what the standards are. A failure to train, it does constitute a violation of the OSHA. We talked in the OSHA presentation about the fact that an employee who is assigned to work the very first day in a new area has to be trained before he or she starts that job, even if the assignment is just going to be a single day, because obviously the employee needs to know what the risks are. If you don't know what the risks are, your first day on the job may be your last day on the job, literally. And so you have to make sure that communication happens and that communication is documented. OSHA has hazard communication standards, and these are the idea that the employee has the right to know what chemicals he's encountering so that he knows how to be safe around those chemicals. We've all seen MSDSs. These are material safety data sheets. I have an example of one here. There's one for everything. I remember one time I saw the MSDS for liquid paper. You might think, well, how is liquid paper dangerous? Well, I mean, if you breathe it, not so good. If you get it in your eye, not so good. If you ingest it, not so good. Almost anything, if you use in a weird way, can be not so good. And so these apply to virtually all chemicals that you might use in even an office environment, and certainly in an industrial environment. There can be all kinds of hazards that can be very, very serious. One of the reasons why you need this is, let's say accidentally somebody gets some chemical on them, and now you're trying to figure out how to address that matter. Well, you'll look and there'll be a section about first aid. What do you do? Is this something you should put lots of water on, or is that going to make it worse? And this is obviously some information that can be given to the firefighters or the EMS people when they arrive to assist in those types of situations. So this is important stuff to have it on hand, available for the employees, but also available in the event of an emergency. and how you store the stuff. Can you store, is there a particular temperature these items have to be stored at? Do they need to be stored separately from other items, because perhaps if these items combine, they may create toxic fumes, or they may uh, create a fire hazard or something along those lines. Firms who contract with the federal government also have to comply with the DrugFree Workplace Act, which requires that the employers educate their employees about drug-free policies and things like that. Now, if you're not a government contractor, you're usually not required to have this type of presentation. It may or may not make sense given your workplace and the particular issues that might have arisen in that situation. If you do provide this type of training, it can be evidence that you are providing a safer work environment. So that could be a good fact for an OSHA situation that might come up, maybe under the general duty clause. It could also help in a negligent training or negligent hiring case to show the training. So I guess whenever you're doing the training, you always want to be sure to document that and have that in a record that is accessible, so to demonstrate that you were being a responsible employer under those circumstances. Let's consider the issue of how we select trainees. We want to be careful that we don't tend to select people for training who look like us or who think like us. We want to make sure that we have a diverse population and the training opportunities that we provide. As we said before, sometimes you train everybody, for example, in sexual harassment or on OSHA safety issues. Sometimes you may provide extra training for folks who are struggling in the job. Sometimes you might provide extra training for folks who are performing well and who may be ready for the move up. Sometimes you might provide training for people who are legally required to have the training. For example, somebody who happens to have a certain license and needs that license for his or her employment may need, in order to maintain the license, to have continuing training. So there's lots of different categories and things to consider. Training can be a very expensive undertaking for an employer, and so you have to think through how you're going to best invest those benefits. A special type of training is an apprenticeship program. These can be very helpful to workers who perhaps there aren't outlets for more formal training systems. Certain trades rely upon apprenticeship type arrangements, and so that's something you can definitely consider. Many times apprentices may be taking coursework at Collin or somewhere else in addition to the apprenticeship programs that they're doing, and so this can be a way to consider. When you're thinking about who you're going to permit into an apprenticeship program, obviously you can't consider age. You might think, well, we're probably going to be hiring people in their late teens, early 20s, or certainly not older than their 30s, right? Well, no, if somebody in his or her 70s is the right candidate for the position, they can be the successful candidate. Keep in mind that the Age Discrimination and Employment Act would prohibit you from excluding them from consideration. So it's important to, of course, document all the training, including the on-the-job type training. And because training is often the doorway to promotions and raises, you ought to be sure that you are offering training opportunities in a non-discriminatory manner. So we've covered both the performance appraisal topics and the training and development topics. Here's just some tips to think about as we conclude this presentation. Consider using a probationary appraisal process for new hires, again at the 30 or 90 days. This is oftentimes used as a retain or a terminate type of situation. At this point, FMLA hasn't kicked in. You probably have communicated, or hopefully you've communicated at the time of the hiring, that this is kind of a trial period where both sides are trying to figure out whether this is a good fit or not. Typically, if you're doing this before the end of the 90 days, the employee isn't going to be eligible for unemployment benefits stemming from his employment with you. And so this is kind of a good time to decide whether there's a good fit or not. It's pretty rare for people to be able to successfully claim employment discrimination when they aren't retained at the end of the probationary period, unless there's some unusual facts. Occasionally you'll see issues relating to pregnancy discrimination. Maybe someone didn't appear to be pregnant at the time they began work. It became clear that they were pregnant as they continued. So you need to be aware that that can be an issue, or a disability that was initially hidden through the application process that comes to light during the probationary process. That can be an issue. So there are some times where there can be special issues relating to probationary status that raises a concern, but it's a relatively safe time to decide this isn't a good fit. You'll want to be sure to train the line supervisors and managers about how to write and present the performance appraisals to employees, obviously focusing upon those objective, quantifiable measures, and also addressing any latent biases that the supervisors have. You know, we all have them. We've covered some of those in this course where we've talked about how we have implicit or inherent ideas about certain groups of people based upon media that we've been exposed to and other sources of information. And so to tell our managers, well, just put all that aside is a really, really tricky thing to do. And so we need to have oversight and guidance and support for managers and supervisors so that they are given the tools to figure out who's performing best and who's not, and not just relying strictly upon seat of the pants intuition, which may have some inherent or hidden or latent discrimination tendency in that mode. And then, of course, all employees should receive the training that's appropriate for their job responsibilities and that is consistently and reasonably offered to employees. Well, I hope that this presentation has been helpful. It's a little different than our past ones. Hopefully we've tied some concepts together that we've perhaps indirectly referenced at other times in the material. I thank you for your attention as always. If you have questions about the material, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My email is cgroover@collin.edu. I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope that you have a wonderful day. Take care.